In this chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about quadratic equations and graphing them. Quadratic equations are equations where the highest exponent on the variable is 2. So we have an x squared and nothing higher than that. There are two forms of a quadratic equation. The first form is a standard form, and that's f of x or y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. And the other form is the general form. This is a form where we see more often, and that's ax squared plus bx plus c. If this a that's at the beginning is positive, then the graph opens up, and by that we mean that the curve, that U shape, goes like that. If that a at the beginning is negative, less than 0, then the graph opens down, and we mean like that. The U goes down. So when we're graphing, we need to ask ourselves these questions. This is the process. The first thing we ask ourselves is, does the graph open up or down? We have to look at A. If A is positive, the graph opens up. If A is negative, the graph opens down. The next thing we do is find the vertex. And the way we do that depends on whether it's in standard form or general form. If it's standard form, and remember that was y equals a x minus h squared plus k, then the vertex is just hk. Remember from our last chapter that this is telling us to move it left or right, and this is telling us to move it up or down, and so that's how we get the vertex. If it's the general form, that's y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, then we have to find x by using a formula, negative b, or opposite of b, over 2 times a. And then, so that's the first step. And then the second step is that we replace that x in the equation to find y, so that we get the point x comma y. And we'll do that in a minute. Then finally, the third step is that we need to find x-intercepts. And always when we're finding x-intercepts, we make y equal to 0, and then we find x. Then we find y-intercepts, and that means we make x 0, and then we find y. And then we plot those points. So we'll have a point here, or 2 points here, and a point here. And we'll plot all of those, and then we draw a smooth U through those points. So let's try that. So here's a graph, or an equation. The first thing we see is that there is a negative in front of the parentheses. So this is telling us A is negative, and that tells us that our parabola, our U, should open down. The next thing is that this is in standard form, and that tells us that our vertex is read directly off of here. The inside part is backwards. It's not a negative one, it's a positive one, because remember that if it was -1 inside, it meant that we moved right 1, and then +4 means up 4. So our vertex is 1, 4. So let's plot that point, 1, 4. So that'd be like right here. It's hard for me to get it on the computer. Okay, the next step is to find the x-intercepts. To find the x-intercepts, we make y equals 0. So we have 0 is equal to negative x minus 1 squared plus 4. We can subtract 4 from both sides. So we get negative 4 is equal to negative x minus 1 squared. divide both sides by -1. That gives us 4 is equal to x minus 1 squared. And remember, to solve a squared, we take the square root, but when we do that, we have to do positive and negative square root. So now we actually have two problems. Oh, and over here it cancels that out. So we actually have x minus 1 equals a positive 2, and x minus 1 equals a negative 2. So we'll add 1 to both sides here. That gives me x equals 3. And remember, we made y equals 0 from the beginning, so this is really a point. X is 3, y is 0. Over here we'll add 1 to both sides as well. And that gives us x is equal to -1. So this again is another point. This is a -1 and y is 0. So we graph those 2 points. So here's 3, 0, and here's -1, 0. We'll do one more step. Give me a second and let me create some room. So our fourth step will be to find the y-intercept. And remember, that means that we make x be 0. So in our equation we have y equals -0 minus 1 squared plus 4. So we'll simplify what's in the parentheses first. So we have -1 squared plus 4. And then we have to do the exponent. And -1 times -1 is a positive 1. But there's a negative in front of it, so it's a -1 again. So -1 plus 4 is 3. And remember that this is a point because we made x be 0. So x is 0, y is 3, and that's this point right here. So then our final step is that we draw a curve through that. Now I like to start at the vertex and kind of go down each direction. You want it to look as symmetrical as possible. The left and the right should be the same. And there's our graph. Let's do another one. So again, we'll start with looking at A. And A is this number that's in front of the parentheses. So here A is equal to 1. And that's positive, which tells us our graph is going to open up. So the next thing we'll do is look at our vertex. This again is in standard form, so we can just read our vertex straight off of there. The inside one again is backwards. It's not a -2, it's a positive 2, 1. So we can graph that over 2, up 1. So there's our vertex, and we know it's going to go up from there. So next we'll look for the X-intercepts. And to do this, remember, we make y equals 0. So we have 0 equals x minus 2 squared plus 1. I'll subtract 1 from both sides. So I get -1 is equal to x minus 2 squared. And then I would take the positive and the negative square root. Over here that cancels out and leaves me with x minus 2. Now over here, -1 underneath that square root is I. So we would have plus or minus I equals x minus 2. Now this doesn't work because we don't have i's on our graph. We can't graph I, so we have to cross that out. And what that tells us is that there are no x-intercepts. It means this graph doesn't cross the x-axis. So let's think about that for a second. If this is our vertex where we drew it and we know it goes up from there, we can see that if it's going up from here, it's not going to cross the x-axis. So that fits with what we know from step 1. So now we'll look at our step 4, and that's the y-intercept. So remember, to do the y-intercept, we make x equals 0. So we have y equals 0 minus 2 squared plus 1. So this is -2 squared plus 1. Negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4 plus 1. So we get y is 5. And remember that this is a point. We had x was 0, and now y is 5. So we could plot that point right there. And that fits. We're going to draw u up from that vertex, and over here should look like a mirror image of the left. And there's our u. Now let's look at this one where we have a different form. Okay, so this beginning steps is the same. We're going to start off first by looking at a. A is the number that's in front of the x squared, so that's negative 1. And that's negative, which tells us that the graph is going to open down. Then our next step will be to find the vertex. And because this is in general form, we have to use the formula. It's negative b over 2a. In this problem, our b is 4. So we'll have 4 there. And we already said a was negative 1. So this gives us negative 4 over negative 2, which is 2. So what that's telling us is that the x part of the vertex is 2. And now we need to find the y. So to find the y, we go back to this equation and we put 2 in for x. And put it in parentheses. So this tells us that we have 2 times 2 is 4. We have to do the exponent first. Plus 8 plus 1. So we have negative 4 plus 8 is 4 plus 1 is 5. So that vertex is 2, 5. So we can graph that over 2 up 5. Gives us the vertex point right there. Now we'll find the X-intercepts. So remember again, that means we make y equals 0. So we have 0 equals negative x squared plus 4x plus 1. We can solve this in one of two ways. One way is factoring, and the other way is the quadratic formula. But as I look at this, there's not a good way to factor this problem, partly because there's a negative in front, partly because I can't find two things that multiply together to get 1 and add to get 4. So that means that I need to use the quadratic formula. So let me create some space so that we have some room to do that. Okay, so I have x is equal to, and the formula says negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and that whole thing is over 2 times a. So my a here is negative 1, my b is 4, and my c is 1. So I have x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times 1 over 2 times negative 1. We'll do some simplifying. We'll put this together first. So that tells me that's negative 4 plus or minus the square root. And we'll do this in our calculators all at once. And that gives us 20. And on the bottom then, we'll do 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Now remember that this is really two problems. This is really negative 4 plus the square root of 20 over negative 2. And negative 4 minus the square root of 20 over negative 2. So let me rewrite that so that we can find those answers in our calculator. Okay, so I've rewritten where we were, and we're going to finish this piece in our calculators. When we do it in our calculators, we're going to do this top part, hit enter, and then do the bottom part. So we're going to type in negative and then 4 plus the square root of 20 equals, and then divide by -2 equals. And when we do that, plus square root of 20 equals divide by -2, we get -0.2. We'll just call it -0.2. These other numbers after it, but we're graphing it. So we can't be completely accurate on a graph. Remember that that's a point. That's -0.2 and y was 0. So we have -0.20 on a graph. That would be on the x-axis again because we're finding x-intercepts. It would be just to the left of the 0 mark. So let's do it again for the other one. Again, we'll do the top first. So we type in -4 minus the square root of 20 equals, and then divide by -2 equals. And this time we get 4.2, and we'll just call it 4.2 even though it doesn't end right at 4.2. So remember that this is another point. It's 4.2 and y again was 0. So we can mark that on the x-axis. It would be just past 4, and that gives us our 2 x-intercepts. So now we're going to find our y-intercept. So let me create some more space again. Okay, so for our y-intercept, again remember that we make x equals 0. So we have y equals -0 squared plus 4 times 0 plus 1. And the really nice thing about y-intercepts is that they're quick because this is 0, this is 0. That just tells us y is 1. And that gives us the point x is 0, y is 1. X is 0 from here, y is 1 from here. So we can put that on our graph right there. And now we're ready to draw our curve down through here and then down through here. And that's our graph. The second part of the directions here say to use the graph to find the domain and range. So first of all, think about the domain. Are there any fractions in this problem? Nope. Are there any square roots in this problem? Nope. Then the domain is -infinity to +infinity automatically. So now let's talk about the range. Remember that the range we have to read from bottom to top. Okay, it's smallest y values. So if we look reading from the bottom, these go down for forever, which means that our range is going to start at -infinity. And what's the top y value? The top y value happens up here, and that happens when y is 5. Okay? There's a dot at y equals 5, so we're going to include that, and that's our range. In quadratic equations, max or minimum occurs at its vertex. Remember that a maximum is its top point, and the minimum is the bottom point. So that always happens at the maximum. It happens at the vertex if the parabola opens down. It happens at the vertex when the parabola opens up. It only has one or the other. It doesn't have both. So this problem says determine without graphing whether the function has a minimum or a maximum. So remember that the first value, a, tells us how the graph opens. So here a is -3. That tells us it's negative, which means it opens down. And that means that it doesn't have a smallest point because it goes down for forever, but it does have a top point, which means it has a maximum value. So then it says find the minimum or maximum value and where it occurs. So that really is asking us to find the vertex. Okay, so the vertex says that we have to use this formula. We know A is -3. The middle one says B is 6. So we have -6 in parentheses over 2 times -3. So we have -6 over -6, which is +1. So the x part of the vertex is +1. And then we need to stick that back into the equation to find y. So we have -3 times 1 squared plus 6 times 1 minus 13. You can type that into your calculator all at once, and you get y is -10. Okay, so it asks for the maximum or minimum value, and we know it's a maximum, so we would say the maximum value, and remember that value means y value, is -10. And then it says where, so it's at x equals, and up here we found x was 1. So the maximum value is the y value, and then the where part is the x value. Maximum value is -10, happens at x equals 1. And finally it wants the domain and range. So again, the domain, there's no fractions, there's no square roots. So the domain is -infinity to +infinity. And the range, remember we said this graph opened down. We said that right here. So if it opens down and we read from down to the top for the range, it keeps going down for forever. So we'd have -infinity. And then the top is this maximum value that we found here. That's a y value. That fits with our range. So the top value would be -10. We'll stop this video here, and I'll finish the next few examples in the next video.